Once upon a time, in a galaxy far, far away from here, there was one thing that all .NET developers agreed upon, and that was that reference types can have null as a value. And everything was clear, we all knew what we need to do. We did a lot of null checks and everybody was quite happy. But then, nullable reference types hit us with C#8 and suddenly everything became more confusing. What's up with all of those question marks? What's with all of those exclamation marks? But there's light at the end of the tunnel, because in this video I want to lay down a very big picture of nullable reference types. It means not concentrating only on the beautiful part, but also going into the more ugly part of nullable reference types, so stay with me. Hey there and welcome to the Code Wrinkles channel. In this video I want to walk you through what nullable reference types are, but actually more than that. The biggest problem with nullable reference types is that everybody is only talking about the good parts that it solves, but virtually nobody is talking about the bad parts or even about the ugly parts of that. So what I will want to do here in this video is I want to walk you through exactly what's in the value that nullable reference types bring us, but also the challenges, the headaches, the pain that we all get as developers when we want to transition from, let's say, a previous mindset of developing with .NET to the new mindset that we need to have when we want to use nullable reference types. So first, let's understand what nullable reference types actually bring to the table. I've set up a very basic demo application that will walk us through what nullable reference types can actually do for us, but also showcase the challenges that we might have when we want to use this feature. And I have set up this very basic chess player class, which is a model, an entity that you would have probably in most of your applications. So we have here a chess player ID, and then we have some strings like identity ID, first name, last name, description, and we also have this chess player rating class, which is our own class, and we call this rating. Now you can already observe that all these properties kind of like they are underlined with this orange line, which means that there are some warnings, and those warnings are specific or due to this idea of nullable reference types. What I would like to show you to actually get a sense of what nullable reference types are here to fix, I have this very basic setup in the weather forecast controller. Here we have this chess player, we instantiate a new instance, and then we kind of like want to get the blitz rating for that specific player, and then we want to log that information. Now let us run the application and see exactly what it happens when we make a request to that API. Now we have a running application, so I will execute the request. And as I executed the request, you see that we got this exception, which is of course a null reference exception, and we see that, okay, object reference not set to an instance of an object. And I think that as .NET developers, this is probably the most common exception that we get. And what we end up doing is usually pinpoint all the places throughout our code where we might get this type of errors and place everything in null checks. So in this case, we would kind of like, let's move this away. We will kind of like move here and say that, hey, if this rating is null, like if on the player the rating is null, then we probably will not log this. So we'll wrap this basically in a null check. And that's precisely exactly where nullable reference types come in. Because what they help us achieve is actually avoid this type of null reference exceptions. Let's see how that would work. Let's go back to our chess player, for instance. And let's take into consideration that, hey, this might be nullable. You can set basically all the properties in the class that they are nullable reference types by just placing this question mark like we did here. Now, if we go back to the controller right now, what we'll see is that we get here, in this case, some warnings. And the warning is obviously that, hey, rating might be null here. Now, there is a way to actually do this, and we can simply say, okay, if the rating is not null, then I would like to get this property. And let me run the application once again and see exactly what we get back this time. The application is up and running, so let's execute a request. And in this case, we see that we haven't got that null reference exception. Instead, we got this logging that, hey, player rating is null. Now, this very simple feature, the nullable reference types, as you can see already can help us a lot because it avoids us having or getting those null reference exceptions. We as .NET developers have developed a lot of different ways to do null checks. And suddenly with these nullable reference types, we have the possibility to actually get rid of all our null reference exceptions that we used to get in our code. So imagine what the future of our applications would be without any null reference exception at all. That would be certainly great. However, there is one big problem or one big challenge actually that comes with this, and this is the challenge of consistency. Talking about consistency, our application right now is not consistent at all, because what we do here in the controller is, okay, we have to solve this problem or this null reference exception for this rating property by introducing this as a nullable property, which is fine. So we have used this nullable reference types idea, but then for all the others, we don't do this. So this is not consistent right now. If anywhere else in the code I would use the identity ID or the first name or the last name or the description with a very basic chess player instantiation, I would still get a null reference exception. And that's something that we need to solve. So consistency is actually very hard to achieve, because as long as we work with warnings or as long as we get these warnings for nullable reference types, there's also the possibility that we kind of like leave something out and suddenly our application becomes unpredictable. And the consumers of our code will not know anymore, does this piece of code use nullable reference types correctly? Doesn't it use them correctly? So people get confused, and when there is confusion, then there's also place for bad application code. Now, the idea is that to introduce consistency in applications where we say, hey, we want to go with nullable reference types all the way, there are a lot of things that we can do about it. And I would like to mention a very nice blog post that I have read recently from Christian Findlay. Christian Findlay is actually from Australia and is a guy that I follow on Twitter, and it happens that I like him very much because he has a major in philosophy just like me. Now, the idea is that in his article, which by the way I will leave a link down in the description of this video, he exposes a step-by-step procedure through which you can ensure consistency when it comes to nullable reference types in your application. And the first step, or one of the first steps to achieve consistency when it comes to nullable reference types, is to actually treat the warnings as exceptions. Not only conceptually, but really we have a way to do this in our project. So to be consistent, let's go and implement this approach. So we want to treat the warnings that we have right now as errors, and this will ensure that our project will not compile as long as we don't adhere to the whole nullable reference types stuff. So let's right click the project, and here I will go to edit and I will edit the CS profile. And here in the project group, I will add something like this. Treat warnings as errors equals to true. Now this is the easiest way to achieve this, but it's actually probably in production applications not the best one, because that will treat really all warnings as errors, not only the null reference types errors. But there is an extensive documentation on learn.microsoft.com that explains exactly what options do you have to actually configure exactly what warnings do you want to handle as errors, and I will leave a link to this Microsoft documentation in the description of this video, so you might want to check it out. Let me just close this, and as we have done this, we see that we already have some errors. The first thing that we need to do when we want to fix these errors and think in terms of nullable reference types is, are my properties or are these types really nullable or not? Like, do I want to always have a value for those properties, or is it acceptable in my application that these properties in this case are null? And that's a question that we as developers never ask ourselves so often before we had this nullable reference type feature. So if we look a little bit here, we have this identity ID that would be presumably something that's related to ASP.NET users, or probably from a Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity perspective, and that would be a GUID. And I would say that, yeah, if you create a new chess player, well, it needs to also have an identity ID. And then what we can also do is we can have here this first name. Is it required? Like, obviously, if I have an application where users are able to create accounts, I would like for them to have a first name, and I would probably also like for them to have a last name. And last but not least, this idea of description. So that's something that's kind of like optional. So, well, I can accept users or chess players in my chess playing application that don't have a description. So I am just interested in their first name and in their last name. Now that we know conceptually exactly what is acceptable to be null and what null, let's see how we can solve this. Now, the first thing is on this description, we can just go on and click here this question mark, because this is nullable. So we accept nulls here. Now we have to solve the problem with all the other warnings. So let's go on and create a constructor. Now what we will need here is, for instance, to take in a string first name. We will take a string last name. Okay, so we have solved the problem with first name and last name. And the other thing is that we have this identity ID. Now the identity ID, we don't want to get it as a constructor parameter. So what we'll do here instead, we'll say identity ID equals GUID, new GUID, and then to string. So it will turn this into a string. So now we should be good to go. Now we don't have any errors anymore, at least on this class here, but we have some errors here on this controller. And that's obviously because we want a constructor. So we have said that we want a constructor. So let's go on and implement everything that we want in this constructor. So it would be, let's give it a first name. I would use for the last name code wrinkles. And then we would be good to go. Our application is now consistent, and that's really already a great achievement. But then what would be the next step that we would like to do in the application? Of course, we would like to persist this chess player that we have created so far in the database. And in our case, we are using Entity Framework Core. And this is precisely the point where we start to face challenges, or when we start to actually see the ugly parts of nullable reference types in practice. Therefore, the next thing that we would like to do is to add a migration. And I have already an application DbContext here, so we would be good to go. Still, I would like to do a change here because it's very important in the context of this entire topic. So let's, for instance, assume that the names of these incoming parameters are not first name and last name, but are f name and l name. And let's just use this one here and also use the other one here. Now everything is still okay from the perspective of how the code works, and there is a very important reason why I did this. Now the idea is that Entity Framework Core by default, if it finds incoming parameters that match basically the name of some properties and you set them in the constructor, it will simply add them. So you would be able to have this type of constructor and everything would work. However, the instant that you change something, for instance, and the parameter name doesn't correspond to a name of properties or to some names of the properties, then Entity Framework Core will actually throw an error, and we'll see, and we'll take a look at the error just in a few seconds. And the reason why I think this is important is because in most applications, like real applications that we build for our customers for a production purpose, constructors are not always that simple. And there are a lot of cases where you would have to take in constructors some more parameters. So instead of cluttering the constructor here, you might simply just use an own object that contains all the information that you need for that constructor and things similar to that. Now, if we go to Entity Framework Core, and I have here in the tools Entity Framework Core add migration, and I would like to add a migration, and we got this error here, this exception. And if we scroll up a lot, we see that no suitable constructor was found for entity type chess player. And that's an exception that we always, or that we very often get when we work with constructors and Entity Framework Core. Besides that, also this problem with identity ID that I set here always to a new GUID is not really very nice, because it's not very clear always if that will be overridden by EF Core. Theoretically it will be, but still I don't like to have this here. Bottom line is that when we are using Entity Framework Core, for instance, we cannot really rely on a constructor so that we can define values for the properties that are non-nullable. And that's a big challenge for us, because we have to rethink the entire model that we have here, because we want to get rid of the constructor. Now, okay, good, but what do we do instead? Now, we would have a bunch of different options to handle these type of things. The first way to do things would be to simply, well, initialize the properties to some default values. And that's also, let's say, similar to a concept that's known as a null object pattern. So instead of setting something to null, we just set something like a default object. Now, for this identity ID, we could set as a default object this GUID, then new GUID, and then this toString method. And then for the first name and for the last name, we can say here string.empty, so that it would need to be empty as a default. Or if you can go here, also you can string.empty. And here there is a discussion that I also would like to go into, because I have purposely used this example because I have seen it in different blog posts. Now, from my point of view, this is not really okay. So instead of using here a string.empty, well, I would prefer to maybe use any other possible approach, but still string.empty instead of null from my point of view is not really a very big improvement. Now, the cool thing about this is that if you're using C#11, then you have even another option which is cleaner to actually define that, hey, these properties need to have a value. And this is the required keyword. So we can see here that public required string first name and public required string last name. And in this case, what it will happen is that we are obliged to set some values for the first name and the last name, either in the constructor, but okay, we don't have a constructor, but we can set those values also in the object initializer. So what we can do instead here is we can come to this controller, because now we have this error message, but we don't have this constructor anymore. But what we can do here is replace this constructor with an object initializer. And here I can say that for the first name, I can provide my name. And for the last name, I will provide then the name of this channel. And now, theoretically, we shouldn't have any errors. So if we go back, we see that everything is correct. Now that we have this behind of us, there's still some other thing that I would like to discuss when it comes to Entity Framework. The problem is, though, that this chess player rating we are using actually as a navigation property. When it comes to navigation properties, this brings us to take a lot of other things into consideration. Like for instance, when this data is loaded. Because when the data is retrieved from the database, if we have an include that also includes the chess player rating, then it will never be null. But if it doesn't include it, then this chess player rating will be null. So you see that we kind of like have here a very dynamic scenario where this chess player rating might actually be null in some scenarios and will for sure not be null in other scenarios. We could solve this through different things. Now, one of the options would be to set this to null and to use this exclamation point, which is also called the null forgiving operator. And the null forgiving operator just tells the compiler that, hey, here's a value, but this will never be null. So what we are doing here is kind of like we are lying to the compiler that we want to set it to null, but it's not null. So yeah, that's even a moral question, if it's okay or morally acceptable to lie to the compiler. But the idea is that, well, we need to find these type of workarounds if we are going all the way with nullable reference types throughout our project and if we work with Entity Framework Core. And things are not finished here when we think about Entity Framework Core. So if we go back to the app DbContext, we see that we still got an error here. And if we hover the mouse over this app DbContext, non-nullable properties chess player is uninitialized. Now the problem here is of course that we have a DB set of chess player and this is not initialized. We have a constructor, but we don't initialize it in the constructor. The only thing that we do with this constructor is that we pass these DbContext options to the base constructor. Now the thing is that this is something that Entity Framework Core handles, and Entity Framework Core always warranties that we will have an instance of DB set. Even if it is empty, it will still be an instance. So we don't really need to initialize this ourselves here. So this is once again a place where we would be, well, necessary to lie to the constructor and simply set this to null and use the null forgiving operator to say, hey, null, it's actually not really null, it's something. So a first conclusion on using nullable reference types in our application is that when it comes to EF cores, at least, we might have some additional challenges that we need to face. And the bad part of this is actually that resolving these challenges or overcoming these challenges might imply using some very weird and strange workarounds, like lying to the compiler. Why would we even want to do that? But still, if we want to do this all the way, we need to make these kind of trade-offs. However, you have to know that working with Entity Framework Core and nullable reference types is not really the only problem. There is also another very common scenarios that I'm sure you encounter a lot or will encounter a lot in your application, and this is DTOs in conjunction with nullable reference types. What we have here is a very basic chess player DTO that has a first name, a last name, and a description. And we have annotated the first name and the last name with this attribute required, which is actually very important because here I have also reworked a little bit this weather forecast controller, and here I have this one post method and we have this chess player DTO. Now, the thing is that when it comes to model validation and model binding, the way that we are used to do things to annotate our DTOs with this type of attributes like required, this would guarantee us that the model state will not be valid if those properties are not set. So this will guard us for this null reference exception, because if we enter this execution branch, then it means that our model is valid. And our model in this case clearly states that the first name is required and that the last name is required. So we are fully guarded against null reference exceptions just by using this model binding feature in the ASP.NET Core API. But what I want to show you is that there is also another way to get rid of this type of errors in objects like our DTOs here that clearly don't really have a value, because we have already the model state idea that does the validation for us. One other thing that we could do is just simply annotate this file with the nullable disable. And if we annotate it with nullable disable, this will turn off the nullable context on this specific file, and this will make all our errors go away. So once again, we are forced to find very weird workarounds to actually get our DTOs working with this concept of nullable reference types. Do you think we're ready? No, not really yet. Here is yet another scenario that or where we could have some challenges when we want to apply nullable reference types, and this is Razor Pages. Here's another application that I have created during some live streams recently, where we have created or started to create a basic chess playing application with Blazor server. However, we also wanted to have authentication. And authentication in Blazor server we usually actually do throughout Razor Pages. So we have this Razor page for login that contains of course the login model. Now the thing is here on the Razor page is that we have for instance this input. And right now, as we can see, we have a warning here on the constructor, but it clearly states that hey, we have the input, the return URL and the error message. They are not set here in this constructor. So it's exactly because those properties, if we take a look at them, they are not really well specified as nullable. Now for the return URL, we could specify it as nullable. For the error message, we could also maybe specify it as nullable. However, for the input, it kind of like doesn't really make sense. Because the problem here with the Razor Pages is that you have one page model and you have this input model that you use. But for the get, when we have a get for the login page, this of course will be null because we don't need it anymore. But when we make a post, this will never be null. And we also have here input validation or model validation. So if the inputs don't correspond to what we specified basically in the input model itself, then of course model validation won't go further and we will return an error message. So it's kind of like exactly the same scenario that we had previously also with DTOs, also with Razor Pages. And once again, we'll probably end up doing something like, okay, coming here and let's say nullable disable, and then we would get rid of all these type of messages that we had earlier. And by the way, just to give you an example, this is actually this code behind file coming from Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity. So the official Microsoft package for handling default or very simple identity scenarios. And by the way, this page comes, if you scaffold it, by default with nullable disable, because it doesn't really make sense in the context of Razor Pages to annotate or to think about this type of inputs as being nullable or not, because the answer to these questions would be different depending on if you are getting the page or if you are posting the page. Now that we know all the challenges that we have in brand new projects with nullable reference types, imagine what would happen if we would like to transition to nullable reference types in an existing code base that might already be huge. Now, in that case, I would have just a few pieces of advice for you. Transitioning to nullable reference types in an existing code base that's also fairly large is not something that you actually can do in one go. So the way, or I think that the best way you might want to do this is to first enable nullable reference types at the global level in your project, but then add this nullable disable on all existing code files so that you enforce the proper use of nullable reference types for all the new code files that you might generate. And then as time passes, you can come back and one by one go into the existing code files and transition them to use nullable reference types. But as you imagine, that would be a process that would require a little bit of time, so it's not something that you would probably do overnight. To wrap this up, I would like to say that the quantifiable end result of using nullable reference types is actually huge. That would make our applications much more predictable and in the end much better than previously. However, as we have seen, there also are a lot of challenges, headaches and pain points that we might face down the road when we want to be fully nullable reference types compliant, like when we're using Entity Framework Core or DTOs or Razor Pages, but there might be also other scenarios. So overall, I think that nullable reference types have a terrible developer experience, but they come with a great and valuable end result. It's in the end up to you to actually weigh in on all these different options and then define for yourself if nullable reference types make sense for you in the context of your specific project, because these kind of decisions is something that we will always have to make in a certain context that might influence our decision in the end. This being said, thank you really very much for watching. If you have enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit a thumbs up button so you help others to discover this video easier. Also, if you didn't subscribe to this channel, please hit the subscribe button and also the notification bell so that you are notified whenever we have something new happening on this channel. And if you have any type of question or you just want to get in touch with me, don't be shy and head over to the comment section of this video and just leave me a comment and I would be more than happy to get in touch with you. This being said, once again, thank you very much for watching, and until the next time, I wish you the very best.